The Type 99 Mark II 20mm cannon was one of the most feared aircraft weapons ever fielded by Imperial Japan during World War II. Derived from the German MGFF but heavily modified, this cannon represented Japan's shift from light machine guns to true aircraft-killing firepower. Mounted on legendary aircraft like the Mitsubishi Zero, Kawanishi N1 KJ Shiden, and Nakajima J2M Raiden, the Type 99 Mark II gave Japanese pilots the ability to tear enemy aircraft apart with just a few well-placed hits. Unlike rifle-caliber guns that relied on volume of fire, this cannon fired high-explosive shells capable of detonating inside bomber fuselages, ripping wings off fighters and setting fuel tanks ablaze instantly. American pilots reported that a single burst could cripple even rugged aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat or B-24 Liberator. However, the weapon had its weaknesses. Low muzzle velocity meant heavy shell drop, forcing Japanese pilots to master close-range combat. This limitation perfectly matched Japan's aggressive dogfighting doctrine, where pilots closed in tightly before unleashing devastating cannon fire. As the war progressed and Allied aircraft grew tougher, the Type 99 Mark II remained lethal, especially in the hands of veteran aces who knew exactly when to pull the trigger. This cannon symbolized Japan's belief in precision, bravery, and destructive efficiency in aerial warfare. The Type 97 7.7mm aircraft machine gun may look modest compared to later cannons, but during the early years of World War II, it played a critical role in Japan's air dominance. Based on the British Vickers design, this weapon armed early Japanese fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Installed in planes like the A5M Claude and early Zero variants, the Type 97 provided reliable, steady fire during dogfights across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. While it lacked the raw stopping power of larger calibers, its high rate of fire made it deadly against lightly armored Allied aircraft in 1941 and 1942. Japanese pilots often paired these guns with cannons, using the machine guns for aiming and suppressive fire before finishing targets with explosive shells. The weapon was known for its smooth operation and mechanical reliability even in extreme tropical conditions. However, as the war dragged on and Allied aircraft gained armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Type 97 began to lose effectiveness. Still, in the early war period, it helped Japan shock the world by wiping out outdated Allied air forces with terrifying speed and precision. As Allied aircraft became faster, stronger, and more heavily armored, Japan responded with the Type 313mm heavy machine gun. This weapon marked Japan's attempt to bridge the gap between light machine guns and full-scale cannons. Mounted on aircraft like the Ki-61 Haiyan and later bomber interceptors, the Type 3 fired powerful rounds capable of penetrating cockpit armor and damaging engines at longer ranges. Compared to earlier weapons, it delivered improved muzzle velocity and better ballistic performance, allowing Japanese pilots to engage enemies from safer distances. Against American fighters and bombers, the Type 3 proved far more effective than older rifle-caliber guns, especially when concentrated in nose-mounted batteries. However, production limitations and material shortages prevented it from being deployed as widely as needed. Despite this, the Type 3 remains one of the most underrated Japanese aircraft weapons of World War II, representing Japan's late-war struggle to counter overwhelming Allied air superiority. The HO-103 12.7mm machine gun represented Imperial Japan's answer to the increasing durability of Allied aircraft during World War II. Developed from the American Browning design but significantly lightened for aircraft use, the HO-103 was mounted on many of Japan's most important fighters, including the Nakajima K-43, Hayabusa, K-44 Shoki, and Ki-61 Haiyan. Unlike earlier rifle-caliber weapons, this gun could punch through armor plating, damage engines, and ignite fuel tanks with far greater reliability. Japanese pilots often relied on the HO-103 as their primary weapon, especially in aircraft that lacked cannons. Its relatively high rate of fire allowed pilots to maintain continuous pressure on enemy aircraft during turning dogfights. However, the weapon fired a lighter round than its American caliber counterpart, meaning it sacrificed raw stopping power for reduced weight and recoil. This design choice reflected Japan's focus on agility over brute force. In skilled hands, the HO-103 was deadly, but as Allied bombers grew tougher, it increasingly struggled to bring down heavily armored targets, highlighting the growing technological gap Japan faced late in the war. The HO-5 20mm cannon was one of the most important Japanese aircraft weapons of World War II, combining high firepower with improved ballistic performance. Unlike earlier cannons that suffered from low muzzle velocity, the HO-5 fired its shells at much higher speeds, making it far more effective in fast-paced aerial combat. Installed on aircraft such as the Ki-61 Hien, K-84 Hayate, and K-100, this cannon allowed Japanese pilots to engage Allied fighters and bombers at longer ranges with greater accuracy. Each shell carried enough explosive force to cripple an enemy aircraft with just a few hits. The HO-5 represented Japan's realization that close-range dogfighting alone was no longer enough in a sky dominated by heavily armed bombers and escort fighters. Although production numbers were limited, the HO-5 became a favorite among experienced pilots due to its balance of power, accuracy, and reliability. Against B-29 superfortresses, it proved especially valuable, giving Japan one of its few effective aerial counters to high-altitude bombing raids. The HO-155 30mm cannon was designed with a single terrifying purpose: to destroy American heavy bombers in as few shots as possible. As B-29 superfortresses devastated Japanese cities, conventional weapons proved insufficient. The HO-155 answered this crisis by firing massive high-explosive shells capable of tearing through bomber structures and igniting fuel tanks instantly. Mounted on specialized interceptor aircraft like the Ki-102 and experimental fighters, this cannon delivered overwhelming destructive power at the cost of weight and recoil. Firing the HO-155 required discipline and precision, as ammunition supply was limited and recoil could destabilize lighter aircraft. However, when it hit, the results were catastrophic. Even the heavily armored B-29 could be crippled or destroyed with a single accurate burst. The HO-155 symbolized Japan's desperate late-war push for raw stopping power, prioritizing destruction over maneuverability in a sky increasingly controlled by Allied air forces. The Type 5 30mm aircraft cannon was one of the most powerful air-to-air weapons ever produced by Imperial Japan during World War II. Developed late in the war and inspired by the German Mk-108, this cannon was designed specifically to counter high-altitude American bombers, especially the B-29 Superfortress. Mounted on elite interceptor aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate and experimental fighters, the Type 5 fired massive high-explosive shells capable of ripping bomber wings apart with just one or two hits. Unlike earlier Japanese cannons, the Type 5 delivered overwhelming destructive force, sacrificing rate of fire and velocity for sheer lethality. When shells struck their targets, the internal explosion often caused catastrophic structural failure. American aircrews reported aircraft being destroyed in seconds after encountering heavy Japanese interceptor fire. However, the cannon's weight and limited ammunition required disciplined firing and perfect positioning. The Type 5 symbolized Japan's final technological leap in aerial weaponry, a weapon built not for dogfights, but for killing the most heavily defended bombers in the sky. The Type 94 37mm aircraft cannon stands as one of the most intimidating weapons ever mounted on a Japanese aircraft. Originally developed for bomber interception and ground attack, this massive cannon fired shells capable of obliterating enemy aircraft with a single hit. Mounted on aircraft such as the Nakajima Ki-45 Toryū heavy fighter, the Type 94 was designed to attack Allied bombers from close range. Its sheer firepower made it devastating, but its low rate of fire and heavy recoil demanded extreme pilot skill. Firing this cannon was less about sustained combat and more about delivering one decisive, fatal blow. When a shell connected, the damage was catastrophic. Wings snapped, engines exploded, and fuselages disintegrated mid-air. Despite its destructive potential, the Type 94's weight and slow firing rate limited its effectiveness in fast-paced aerial combat. Still, it remains a symbol of Japan's early experimentation with extreme-caliber aircraft weapons. The Ho 203 37mm cannon was a refined and more effective evolution of Japan's heavy aircraft gun program. Designed specifically to combat heavily armored Allied bombers, this weapon combined massive shell size with improved reliability and rate of fire. Mounted primarily on the Nakajima Ki-45 Toryū, the HO-203 allowed Japanese interceptor crews to fire devastating rounds directly into bomber formations. Each shell carried enough explosive power to cripple even the most robust aircraft. Unlike earlier designs, the HO-203 was better suited for aerial combat, offering smoother operation and faster follow-up shots. However, its large caliber still limited ammunition capacity, forcing crews to choose their shots carefully. In combat, successful hits often resulted in instant destruction, making the HO-203 one of the most feared bomber-killer weapons Japan ever fielded. This cannon represented Japan's determination to stop Allied bombing campaigns at any cost. The HO-203 37mm cannon was a refined and more effective evolution of Japan's heavy aircraft gun program. Designed specifically to combat heavily armored Allied bombers, this weapon combined massive shell size with improved reliability and rate of fire. Mounted primarily on the Nakajima K-45 Toryu, the HO-203 allowed Japanese interceptor crews to fire devastating rounds directly into bomber formations. Each shell carried enough explosive power to cripple even the most robust aircraft. Unlike earlier designs, the HO-203 was better suited for aerial combat, offering smoother operation and faster follow-up shots. However, its large caliber still limited ammunition capacity, forcing crews to choose their shots carefully. In combat, successful hits often resulted in instant destruction, making the HO-203 one of the most feared bomber-killer weapons Japan ever fielded. This cannon represented Japan's determination to stop Allied bombing campaigns at any cost. The Type 1 12.7mm defensive aircraft machine gun marked a significant upgrade in Japanese bomber defense capabilities. Introduced to counter increasingly aggressive Allied fighter attacks, this weapon delivered far more stopping power than earlier rifle-caliber guns. Installed on bombers like the Mitsubishi G4M and later heavy aircraft, the Type 1 could penetrate fighter armor and damage engines with frightening effectiveness. Allied pilots quickly learned to respect Japanese defensive fire, especially during tail or beam attacks. However, despite its power, the weapon suffered from limited ammunition supply and mounting constraints that reduced its firing arcs. Even so, in the hands of skilled gunners, the Type 1 turned vulnerable bombers into deadly traps. This gun symbolized Japan's desperate attempt to keep its bombers alive in increasingly hostile skies dominated by faster, better-armed Allied fighters. The Type 92 7.7mm aircraft machine gun was one of the earliest standardized weapons used by Imperial Japan during the interwar period and early stages of World War II. Mounted on both fighters and bombers, it played a major role in Japan's early air victories over poorly equipped opponents. Based on proven foreign designs, the Type 92 was reliable, easy to maintain, and capable of sustained fire during long missions. Against lightly armored aircraft, it was highly effective, allowing Japanese pilots and gunners to dominate early conflicts in China and Southeast Asia. However, as the war escalated and Allied aircraft improved dramatically, the limitations of the Type 92 became painfully obvious. While it lacked the power to destroy modern fighters and bombers, it remains an important historical weapon that helped Japan establish early air superiority and shocked the world with rapid, decisive victories.